The Canadian housing boom could be officially over. A massive policy U-turn is set to put downward pressure on house prices, potentially popping one of the world's largest housing bubbles. And this serves as a major warning to the Australian housing market, which could follow suit. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I ordered a book on Amazon the other day titled How to Scam People Online. It still hasn't bloody arrived. But you'll never get scammed if you watch my content. Unless you're expecting a Greek god, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm only an Adonis.
That chiseled Adonis?
So please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll keep you up to date on the big financial stuff that can affect your life. Now, why might the Canadian housing bubble be about to pop, and what could it mean for Australia?
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The federal government is making major changes to immigration numbers in Canada, pulling up the welcome mat and closing the door to tens of thousands of people it was planning to allow into the country in the years ahead.
This is a massive reversal for Canada, who along with Australia have pumped immigration levels the most since the pandemic. Both countries turned on every immigration lever they could, and now they're both suffering from the worst housing crisis in the developed world.
We are acting today.
Action is absolutely what we need, because millions of locals in Canada and Australia are now completely locked out of the housing market. And worse than that, they're one financial shock away from homelessness. Is any action taken now too little too late? Or can we really make tangible improvements in housing affordability for current citizens and future generations?
Because in the tumultuous times as we emerged from the pandemic, between addressing labor needs and maintaining population growth, we didn't get the balance quite right.
In other words, we royally screwed up. You see, we'd already gone through pandemic stimulus policies and all this extra money that was pumped into the economy. Well, there's only one place it ends up in countries like Canada and Australia: bloody property. And that's because both our nations are completely obsessed with accruing wealth via property. You only have to look at the chart to see that house prices in Canada and Australia have grossly outperformed wages for multiple decades now. And this means that housing affordability gets worse year after year, and for each new generation, it's harder and harder to get into the market. So then, after putting a rocket under house prices due to government spending and interest rate cuts, we went absolutely burko with immigration. So when house prices really should have corrected after insane speculation, they got even worse, because now we had more people competing for each individual property, whether to buy or to rent.
For a country built on immigration, it is a significant shift, one driven by public and political pressure.
Stating that Canada is a country built on immigration is very telling. In my opinion, both Canada and Australia have used increasing immigration to help grow their economies. You bring in more people, they have to buy more goods and services within the country, and in the official figures, that shows that the entire economy is growing. But the downside is that many individual citizens actually go backwards financially, because housing costs go up, wages are suppressed, leading to millions of residents having less disposable income overall. And that's when you end up with a per capita recession, which is exactly what's been happening in both Canada and Australia.
It's one of the biggest policy reversals in Justin Trudeau's tenure.
It's one of the biggest reversals since luxury vehicle maker Jaguar changed its branding from this to this. And what do you think about that? I am definitely not a fan.
We're announcing that we will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years.
A good decision. When citizens are struggling through the worst housing crisis in history, you need to take drastic action to support your citizens. Now, building supply is good, but it takes many years and there's multiple hurdles, especially with the effects of the pandemic making building so much more expensive. However, if you can drastically reduce demand by lowering immigration, that will have an immediate positive impact on housing affordability, because there'll be less overall people competing for each property. And it will also put downward pressure on house prices, which could finally pop the Canadian housing bubble. And if you don't think there's a bubble, check out some of these Canadian house prices and compare that to the price of actual European castles.
We're starting off with 14 Grange Avenue, and what will it cost you to live here? Only $2.85 million. We're going to compare it to a castle. In this case, Orchardton Castle in Scotland.
Here's what it costs in pounds.
Here's what it costs in Canadian dollars. This is 1775 Cedar Crescent, a 6-bed, 3-bath home in Vancouver, BC. So, what'll it cost you to live here? Only $6.2 million. But, as always, if you don't have enough money for the house in Canada, you can settle for this castle in Switzerland instead.
Canada had planned to accept 500,000 permanent residents annually. Now that number will be slashed by more than 20%, decreasing every year until 2027.
That's a large decrease, and because it's occurring over multiple years, will significantly reduce buying demand over Canadian property.
One concern the Bank of Canada has repeatedly highlighted about immigration, how new immigrants, through no fault of their own, have been a major contributor to increasing rents and house prices relative to how many houses are being built.
This is basic supply and demand impacts, but I'm glad it's being discussed. When there's not enough housing for the current population combined with all the additional population coming in, it creates ridiculous demand, pushing up the prices of both houses and rents. Because housing isn't a luxury where you can avoid it. Everybody needs a place to live.
It is also undeniable that the volume of migration has contributed to affordability.
I appreciate this being said out loud. In Australia, it feels like the messaging we're receiving is that no matter what the immigration levels, it doesn't have any impact on housing affordability. So being real and looking at both options of increasing housing supply as well as reducing overall housing demand will go a great way to easing the current crisis, but could also impact on house prices.
Canada's population is now projected to decline by 0.2% in the next 2 years, which according to StatsCan would be the first time since Confederation that the number of people in Canada would decline.
This is why this reversal is so massive. We've gone from Canada seeing the highest population growth out of all developed nations to now predicting an actual population decline over the next 2 years. Let's listen to the Canadian Prime Minister talk directly about this immigration reversal.
Immigration. Let's talk about it.
Let's talk about those Greeks coming in and starting up so many fish and chip stores. Who loves a battered sav?
In the last 2 years, our population's grown really fast, like baby boom fast.
Too fast.
And it's not from more Canadians having babies, that's for sure. How can you have babies when you can't even afford to buy a house or even pay the rent?
Looking back, when the post-pandemic boom cooled and businesses no longer needed the additional labor help, as a federal team, we could have acted quicker and turned off the taps faster.
As soon as it was clear that rampant speculation had entered the housing market, that's the time when policies needed to be adjusted to help dampen that overheated market. But acknowledging you went too hard for too long is a step in the right direction.
Canada's new immigration plan is straightforward. Lower the number of new immigrants coming into Canada, both temporary and permanent.
This suggests a comprehensive immigration overhaul, which if it's followed through, would definitely help to improve the housing crisis, but in addition, could send house prices significantly lower.
Between the amount of people coming and going, we'll effectively pause population growth for the next 2 years. Then from 2027 onwards, it'll balance out and slowly start increasing again at a sustainable pace. In fact, that gets us back to the population growth path we were on before the pandemic.
It still feels like the overall policy is to grow the economy via immigration. However, it is a meaningful change and should provide significant relief to those who are really struggling.
This pause is going to give our economy and our communities the chance to catch up with things like our plan to build millions more homes. Our cap on international students is already bringing rental prices down in big cities, and as we keep that cap in place, rents will keep coming down.
Alright, so the big question, what about house prices? There's no question that both Canada and Australia have some of the most expensive housing in the world, and they also have some of the worst housing affordability in the world. According to the latest Demographia Housing Affordability Report, after Hong Kong, Sydney has the second worst affordability, followed by Vancouver, Canada. So 2 cities in some of the largest countries by landmass hold the title of most expensive in the world. That's because both countries have prioritized housing as a way to accrue wealth, and because that wealth has been accrued so fast over so many years, it's now become an obsession. So why might this Canadian housing bubble finally be ending, and what could it mean for Australia? Now, first of all, a bursting of a housing bubble can take different forms. There is the scenario where house prices can really crash with huge percentage declines. But there's the other scenario where house prices don't necessarily crash, but they underperform for several years or even decades. If both these countries get serious on reducing their permanent and temporary immigration levels, that will significantly reduce demand and should see lower or slower growing house prices. Then we've got the crazy level of debt against property in Canada and Australia, combined with high interest rates, which are forecast to stay higher for longer and not to return to those crazy low levels. This should also provide a dampening effect on house prices, as it makes it harder for first home buyers to get into the market, but it also makes it harder for investors to buy additional investment properties. Next, we've got unemployment. Both Canada and Australia have experienced long-lasting per capita recessions. This is reducing the amount of disposable income of the average person, and as people have less, they'll spend less into the economy, which will eventually lead to increased job cuts. Now finally, we could see Canada and Australia bring in policies that help to reduce overall demand for housing. With more and more people locked out of the housing market and becoming forever renters, there'll be more pressure on governments to look after renters, and one of the best ways they could do that is to reduce demand for property. So Canada's massive reversal on immigration could just be the catalyst to burst the housing bubble. I'm Biko Konstantinos.